everyone, and welcome back to Processing Severance. If you're new or joining us again and returning, thank you for being here. My name is Rasha G, and I am tightening the leash today. I'm also joined by my fellow Lumen members, Rob L.
I am so happy to be here again, and I want everyone to know that I am also a black beauty watermelon from the country of Malaysia.
Wow. Shadan L.
Hello, everyone. In the event of my departure from this podcast, you have exactly 9 seconds to honor my memory and thank Kier for the opportunity to get to know me.
And Mike M.
Hey everyone, we are filtering this podcast for innies only, so just keep that in mind.
Wow, I love this clever team. Thank you all for being here today. So, today we are going to talk about season 2, episode 5. This episode is titled A Trojan's Horse and is directed by Samuel Donovan and written by Megan Ritchie. Now, as always, I want to take a moment and thank everyone who watched or listened to the show last week. And I also want to give a shout out to some people who sent in their questions. And if you'd like to participate and send in your questions, you can write to us at processingseverance@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Or as always, you can comment below on the YouTube channel site. And of course, we are found in all different podcast sites as well. All right, today's questions and comments, and this is in reference to season 4, so I quickly want to highlight and give them a shout out. Not all but most says, this was the first time I was disappointed in an episode of Severance. I thought it was too out there. There was so much unnecessary yelling and screaming in this scene where Irv tries to drown Helly. I feel that. It felt off pace, and the rest of the show felt like it had different writers and directors. That's interesting. It required too much suspension of belief. How are the Shadow Twins getting in front of them to show the way? Why didn't Milchek hear Irv screaming for him during the night, but in the morning he came running? Ugh, I was looking forward to this episode more than any of them. Thanks so much, not all but most. Team, how do we feel about some of the stuff that this person shared with us today?
Not
Yeah,
all but most. Thank you for the comments, first off.
Yes.
Rob, go ahead. Sorry. I totally
no, not at all. I actually I can see where this person is coming from. Obviously, this is all subjective. I really loved it because I didn't mind the change of pace, but I feel like if some people really love the story of Severance and how it all fits in with the innies and the outies and Lumon, perhaps maybe this was something that was too much of a diversion. And I can get where you're coming from. I don't really agree, but that's okay. We're all allowed to not agree.
Yeah, I can see where it may have felt again a little pace off for other people. I actually enjoyed the episode as well because I felt like it was a little different compared to the other episodes, especially since we kind of see them outside of the office and in a completely different element, and we start seeing a lot more interaction with the characters and their personalities coming out. So, but I'm glad, thank you for sharing what you felt because I think it's always intriguing to hear how people are processing each of these episodes.
I do agree. I think this last episode in particular did really require you to kind of throw everything out the window and go with
Mhm.
it. But I feel like that's where I am with Severance in general at this point, is
Mhm.
I've kind of stopped trying to make sense of it a little bit, and I'm just like, let me go wherever you want me to go.
I think also, when you change up the format a little bit, it's definitely, I can understand why folks would be a little disappointed with that. I love the episode, but I understand if you're not used to it. It is jarring. It is kind of weird. But yeah, also like Shadan was saying, you kind of have to go with the weirdness of this series just in general. And I mean, if there's any weight to the VR theory that people are, that we talked about last time, yeah, that actually could explain some of the weirdness here too. So we'll see how it plays out. I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes, and so come back this week and let us know what you thought of episode 5. I'd be curious to hear what you have to share. Elizabeth K007 talked about the scene in the tent with Mark and Helena. It disturbed this person even before the reveal. Irving was the standout in this episode. What I'm wondering is, do you think the story about Kier's brother is literal, that he did have a brother, or is it actually a metaphor about what he perceives as the two sides of himself, good versus bad? I know this has been coming up a lot too, and I feel there is something. Maybe there wasn't a twin. Maybe this is Kier seeing two parts of this puzzle That's something I've been wondering about myself.
I think that's the whole thing behind Severance is there are these people with two sides of themselves, the innies and the outies. It's very possible to take a look at something like Kier and assume that a twin is a different personality for himself, the same way that an innie and an outie would have two different beings inhabiting the same body. So yeah, spot on.
And then we've got Mike Boyer, who emailed, um, I found the story of Dieter Egan could have been more of an allegory. What if Kier didn't have a literal twin? Okay, so this was, but Dieter was what he named as his shadow self. So that's something. And then rather than admit that he was the better half, he invented Dieter as a way to express his baser impulses without the feeling weight of guilt. And the cat of nine tails could actually have self-flagellation in the cave. Irving in the dead of winter deciding that he can see Helena's Helly's shadow and letting the interpreters, Milchick and the person on the other side of the radio, declare 6 more weeks of winter, which is a punishment, instead of an early spring, could have been referring to Groundhog Day since it was just 5 days ago for us. That's such an interesting
Oh,
observation.
you
What do
know,
you all think?
I, by the way, Mike, Boyer, I don't know how to say your last name. Sorry if I mangled it. You keep giving us these really interesting insights. Please keep it up, man. Like I'm like now every episode I'm waiting for Mike to email us because you're onto something there. I both Elizabeth and Mike are talking about this not literal or literal twins. We see a lot of imagery about duality in this show. This the innies, the outies. You'll recall that you can see a lot of reflections. There's a scene where Mark S is in the middle, and there are two. There's Helly and Helena reflected in the like. It's constant. It's a constant theme that runs through the show. So we have to keep our eye on that. So very, very good pickup.
Also the groundhog theory is interesting because correct me if I'm wrong, but episode 5 airs on Valentine's Day, correct? And touches
Yeah.
quite heavily on love and sort of these
Yeah.
these romantic relationships. So I do think the timing of Groundhog Day is interesting. I want to say for now, I think I'm going to take the twin literally because I think family largely plays a big thematic role in the show. We see this with Devin and Mark and sort of the Egan family. And I think it's really interesting, speaking of the Egans, how Kier is sort of this image of piety, perhaps, and he's using this biblical language, but he's quite literally willing to sacrifice his daughter to get what he wants. And so I think this theme of family is really important, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. So for now, I think I'm gonna go with a literal brother, but I'm gonna be watching to see if maybe I feel differently.
Well, thank you, team. And with that, I'd love to go into breaking down episode 5 and all the different interpretations that we could come up with for this particular episode. I want to start off with Trojan's horse, just even quickly touching upon the title, because Trojan's horse basically signifies a malware that misleads users. I looked this up of its true intent by disguising itself as a normal program. It's derived from the ancient Greek story of deceptive Trojan horse that led to the fall of the city of Troy. So it's interesting to see how we see some of that kind of playing out in this episode as well. Did that kind of correlate for you all when you saw the title and then we're just thinking of the different or seeing and experiencing the different scenes that were happening through the episode? Because obviously, I think from the beginning of season 2, we knew this in season 1 too, but I felt like in season 2 we're really starting to see that deception side. I mean, one of the scenes that stood out to me in playing to this too, even was the whole part of where Milchick is getting his first review, and they're criticizing his kindness and for him wanting to build this team and all that stuff. Like there were a lot of things that they hit upon, which again went to that thing of what and then going back to the cold harbor and making sure that there's like this deceptive thing going on of there's a deeper lying meaning and some other cunning stuff that's going on that not everybody's aware of. Rob, I see you thinking over there. What's happening in your mind?
Yeah, that's really deep because like is Helena the Trojan horse? By the way, why Trojan's horse? Is that just an error? Is that intentional? Everything on this show is intentional. So I'm like, why is it a plural?
I thought about that. I think it's just, I mean, there's probably multiple meanings as there always is, but I think it's just Rickon kind of showing that Rickon's just dumb. And he says Trojan's horse because he wants to sound intelligent, but in reality, he just really doesn't know what he's talking about. And also, I think there are multiple Trojan horses. I think
Mhm.
Helena is one, Mark is
Yep.
one. Clearly, this
Mhm.
episode, I think Milchick is one, Cobell is one, Kier is one. Like, there's multiple sort of Trojan horses here, as evidenced by this
Mhm.
episode. Irv,
Yep.
Bert,
Miss Wong.
go on,
Yeah.
yeah.
When you think about this episode, especially, yeah, we see that there's so many insiders and outsiders that are kind of on to something, that have their own agenda. Miss Huang is reporting up to the board. She's basically the Trojan horse with Milchek. Helena has been the Trojan horse the entire time with the group. Mark is kind of a Trojan horse for anti-severance policies, and the same thing with Irv too. So yeah, you had so many different plants with different agendas, both on both sides, trying to accomplish some sort of expose, happening here. So yeah, it's definitely an apt title, I'll say.
Agreed. Well, that being said, let's dive into maybe some scenes that stood out or some moments that we think are prevalent as we go into episode 6. Shadan, what's one thing that really stood out to you or got your mind thinking on this episode that maybe either led to more questions or opened more doors?
Well, you guys know I always tend to lead with my emotions, and speaking of this episode again airing on Valentine's Day, I think the Helly and Mark sort of scenes were really interesting where she says, how did you not know that it wasn't me? And she's kind of hurt that he couldn't tell the difference. And there's like a real pain there. And she's sort of trying to figure out, what she missed out on and why the dynamic of their relationship is different now. We kind of talked before we started recording about how amazing Britt Lowell's performance is this season, but the pain she's able to convey really struck me in her scenes with Mark.
I'm going to jump in real quick and just on that theme of pain, I do want to say that we do see that in several incidences too. Like Dylan, even though you're not physically seeing him cry, his pain is coming out through anger, right? The scene where the three of them are with Milchick and he's talking about the having a funeral for Irv and all this. Like Dylan's response is yelling at him, like, well, you can at least do this for us. Where is he? And he's constantly fighting. And I feel like that's really coming from a very painful place. And even with Mark, the last scene for me, there's this like a gut punch when you just see his expression of what he's experienced and then the flashes that he's having. So I felt throughout this, and even the conversation with Devin and Rickens, when she walks up and leaves and he's trying to just, kind of do his creativity, yet he wants his wife's support. That's a different form of pain too, where she's like, okay, well, you're not really being authentic to who you are. You're not being honest and
Gosh, I
you're
just want to say quickly to agree. Funny that we had the commentator say that last episode was a bit loud. I think what this episode did really brilliantly was communicate a lot of things quietly, and we can touch on Natalie as well, how much she communicates. So it's interesting that the episodes are polar opposites in some ways in terms of how the emotions are communicated.
Oh, that's yeah. I feel that, Shadan. Mike, what stood out for you in this episode, or maybe a favorite moment?
Yeah, and Robert, you and I were talking about this a little bit. The Exports Hall prologue, and really just the creepiness of that scene altogether, but also some of the hidden, innuendo, I guess, for lack of a better term, particularly in what the guy that they send to pick up whatever it is from O&D, and goes to the exports hall, the song that he's singing, which for folks who might not be aware, it's actually The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot. And that song was a tribute to a real life incident in November 1975, surrounding the sinking of a bulk carrier ship called the SS Edmund Fitzgerald on Lake Superior, which shipped iron from Minnesota to Michigan to Ohio in, the dead of winter. And, if you think about the idea of Cold Harbor and sinking and, freighters and shipping and stuff like that, it's a very apt song, especially for a guy coming from the exports hall and bringing things back and forth between the severed floor to the export hall. So there's something at play there, and I think shipping things and exporting things has to be really, really pertinent to not just this episode, but the series as a whole. And I've got my theories on that, but I kind of wanted to see what Robert thinks too, because you're the one that
Yeah.
you kind of brought that up.
And I want to say
I
those
was, yeah,
those tools look like surgical tools to me. I don't know.
yeah,
Like the first thing I'm thinking of
surgical.
is somebody's brain is being operated on. So I
Yep.
just wanted to
Yeah.
throw that in. And yeah,
Mhm.
go ahead,
The
Rob.
whole the whole scene from the moment we see the faceless man roll that cart through wherever they are towards Felicia and the colleague, you note that they're framed on the side and then they're kind of reflected on that cold cabinetry. They hand the surgical implements over. It's so beautifully framed. You never see his face. There's like shelving here, so you don't see it. And then he turns around, he keeps whistling. That song was driving me crazy. I had every AI under the sun trying to work out what the song was, and Mike's like, "I found it. This is what it is," that's when my mind went, because that makes a lot of sense. It's a Cold Harbor reference. It's about shipping, this obsession that they have with shipping and exporting. What are they exporting? What are they importing? I don't know. Tell me. Give me some answers. I have no idea.
Yep.
Well,
And
it's definitely all around Cold Harbor because we've got that beautiful scene too where you see it's a very quick scene where Mark is flipping through like a Rolodex type of thing and he stops at Cold Harbor, right, on his computer. I want to, I know, Mike, you were going to say something. I just want to throw out there too. What I loved about this episode is I actually felt it was quick paced. Like we were in and out of scenes like this. And but you were left with enough nuggets to make you think about where it's leading you to, but the scenes did not drag on. And I actually feel like we covered a lot in this episode, right? With so many different situational experiences. So Mike, please go ahead.
when you think about the idea of innies and outies, right? Exporting things is putting things out, shipping things out. So it's the surgical tools and everything. It's making me think of the theory that, people are trying to have innies take over outie bodies in the real world altogether, because they're exporting the innies into the real world to the outies. So I don't know. It's all, I feel like it's all connected somehow. you know.
No, I mean, it definitely is connected. So let's talk about Mark S. really quick because it's so interesting that we see more of the flashes happening in this episode, right? Especially towards the end, scene two. And do you think this is because of the process that he's been going through with Ragabi, right?
Mhm.
Do you think this is an impact of that? I mean, we see him taking some pills. We see the flashback.
Yeah.
We're seeing more both as an innie and an outie, right?
That's right. That's right. Oh, good point, Rasha.
This
It's
was one of the
both of them.
times. Yeah. What do
And
you
they're living together now. So Ragabi's embedded with him, and she says he's got one more day until something. He's drinking this goo. I don't know what it was, egg white. I don't know. And taking pills. And the flashes he keeps seeing of Gemma slash Miss Casey really, really hit home at the end, obviously, where he finds himself on the severed floor as well as outside Lumen in his home, and it keeps flashing in and out. Beautiful. The way that was constructed and edited and shot was incredible. And then, of course, the episode glitches again and cuts to black after he's heard Miss Casey's dulcet tones tell his innie about how wonderful his Audi is. I don't know what they were getting at there. I really don't. I really want to know, but all I could think about at the time was I was just marveling at Adam Scott's performance. The despair, frustration, devastation, confusion on his face with the tears. That's just
he
amazing.
when he's talking to Ragabi too, there was that because this episode was interesting for me with Mark in the sense that I feel like he's just cold in the beginning, because I think he's trying to make sense of what has been happening between Helena and Helly and all of this stuff, right? So now this whole trust factor has become an issue. But by the time we see him with Ragabi, there's this one line where he's asking her, "Is she okay?" And you feel again like that punch in his heart of like, "Is my wife okay?" Like I know she's alive now. And what was eerie was that little box that had the cremation remains. And
Yeah.
he's like, "Well, who is that?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." And that just hits home on a whole different personal level with the loss I had in a cremation. So I was like, oh my God, this is horrible knowing that you don't know
Yeah.
whose ashes are in there. But coming back to the show, it's you really see these peaks and lows of his character and really starting to see his personality. And I think it's really, these flashes are coming from this process that he's going through. And so maybe she wants to wait a day to kind of let it sink in more or to let the body rest so that it can start, more images can start coming up for him. And maybe we'll start seeing that in episode 6, because we definitely saw more of Miss Casey coming out in this episode, or at least preluding that for episode 6, right? So, and we're
Yes.
hearing about his Audi, something we didn't know about before. Yes, Shadan.
Well, it's interesting because last episode we talked a lot about the emotions, and I was sort of saying, are their emotions being measured in some way? What role does that play? And in the beginning, when Helly's sort of in front of the quote unquote board, like they do tell her your tempers will rebalance quickly. And so what we see with Mark is clearly his tempers are really out of balance, which is why his sort of reaction during the funeral for Irv is off. And then we also, in that board meeting, they say what Mark S's project is 81, he's 81% there. So clearly, like we're
84.
84%. So clearly we're reaching the end of something. And so like that also could be why he's sort of out of balance. With the hair and makeup team, I feel like there's really subtle differences with the way that the innies and outies are physically portrayed. Like Helena's look is much softer when
Mhm.
she's an innie versus an outie, and then the same is true of Mark. And I can't, it's harder with men to pick up on makeup, but it's almost like his features look harsher when he's in the real world, or he appears almost like sicker in the real world. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I picked up on that, especially with Helly and Helena. You see the hairstyle change, and it's so funny because this is so minute, and I'd have to probably go back, but I kept focusing on her eyebrows. Because I felt that in the opening, like when we see her in that office, her eyebrows are really very sharp, and the hair is taken back, and it's just very corporate. And even though she's still working, when we see Helly, the color of the hair seems a little bit brighter, and while it's still very professional, it's still a little bit louder, the way it's down and just very full. And I've noticed that about Mark S's hair as well.
I think it's definitely indicative of this theme of control, and potentially as well the theme of that corporate culture has on the control of people. When you think about the innies, they're all put together, they're all clean, they're all like, that. But then the real world is messy. Outside of work, real life is messy. So Mark is a mess and everything like that. The only person that's not a mess is Helena, but that's because she represents that control. So I think it's very telling about what the show is trying to say about not just corporate culture, but the idea of control and the idea of chaos, in the outer world versus the inner world.
Mm. And what about the scene between Irv and Bruce? It's so interesting because I love Irv, and it's so interesting to take note of how his innie is so in love. And remind me too about the painting, the little picture artwork that he left in that room behind the painting. I got to come back to that. I don't want to forget that one. But the interaction between him and Bert when he's outside. So he makes a call to someone that we don't know. And I feel like this is leading into the theory of definitely he's an investigative authority, or been, part of one of these Secret Service agencies or something, where he really has the skill set, right, to do a deeper dive into things. But him and Bert are just so disconnected in the Audi world, and it seems like Irv has now become this third wheel between Field and who's Bert's partner. And yeah, I thought that
Ah.
whole interaction was interesting.
Yeah, I did as well. Because I don't know what they're getting at here, but it just you could see these two men gravitate towards each other once they were encountering each other face to face, and that it just goes to show that even though they had this erotic entanglement, whatever they Lumon wanted to call it, inside, they wouldn't have had any idea what was going on. Something within them still gravitates towards each other. So, the power of love, the power of connection, the power of relationships, all of that stuff, I think, is being discussed and explored in that moment. But having Bert's husband's named Fields is so weird to me. I looked it up and nothing really came to mind as to what that meant apart from agricultural things, which I don't think really, I think that's a red herring. I have a feeling Fields is played by John Noble. I could be wrong. Is that true? John Noble is a really famous Australian actor who was in Fringe. And he's a real. So I'm expecting him to show up at some point because I did see him in the cast list for season 2. Anyway, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know who Irv's talking to, but I think Russia, you are onto something. That Irv could have some other motivation for why he's involved in this whole thing to begin with.
Well, because on the in the phone booth too, I think there, and I don't remember the exact lines, but there was that reference of, oh, I think they're onto us or something, right? Like they may have
Yeah,
nothing. And I want to
yeah.
tag this on in really quick, then going back to the funeral. In the funeral, do you remember at the end where Dylan looks at that photo, that picture that's hanging on the wall and it says hang in there? And somehow, intuitively, I don't know, or he goes up to that and he pulls out that drawing that Irv has left, and it's the drawing of that hallway that leads to that export door. Does that ring a bell to all of you? Do you remember that? Is it
Yep.
just
Yeah.
small? But there's something to that scene. There's a reason that scene was put in there. And I think this is how we're going to start seeing more and more of what is down that corridor and what really does happen in the export area.
I was just gonna say I do love that we get immediate payoff from Irv's cryptic message to Dylan in episode 4, hang in there. And yeah, we also get payoff from his conversation with Felicia in episode 1 too. Where he finds out all about the export hall. Irv is literally the furthest along at cracking this case than anyone, and I'm actually really impressed by that. Also, just happy that John Turturro is alive, not dead. I
Yes,
love
Mike, I'm so with you on that.
I love that Christopher Walken's back because we haven't seen him all season, and yeah, it's just it makes me, yeah, as far as his partner's name Fields, I don't know why. I thought Cookies, probably because Mrs. Fields, and I'm a fatty that loves
Oh,
cookies, so there you go. But I don't think there's any symbolic meaning behind that. I just like cookies. Go
yeah.
ahead, Shadon.
I thought open field, so it's an open
Oh,
playing field.
yeah.
Gonna say, like, the language during the funeral scene was my favorite aspect of this whole episode, because even Milchick, like, he tells Miss Huang, he says, "I'll ready the refreshments and you go focus on the mournful signage." So, like, did he know that that thing was gonna be underneath the mournful signage? And then Dylan, he said at one point, what does he say? "I don't give 3 dry Fs about what his Audi is doing."
Yeah.
That made me laugh so hard. To be honest with you, I wanted that to be my intro for this episode, but I decided I wasn't bold enough to start. It made me laugh and I loved it.
Well, since you mentioned the funeral too, Shadan, the watermelon is back. You all
Mm.
remember that from so, and then the watermelon head of Irving is just, I don't know, that just looked horrific to me. I would be mortified looking at
I
that.
can't.
Rasha, to
Like,
go
who came
back
up
to
with
the
this stuff?
communications of this episode, like the scene where Dylan is just sitting in the room by himself with the watermelon was so striking and like sad, either intentionally or otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also a reason for that too, right? The imported watermelon. Why do we need to mention that the watermelon is from Malaysia? And
Mhm.
it's the black, was it the Black Queen
The
watermelon?
Black Beauty.
Black Beauty. So, oh, sorry, Queen, not Queen, but
It's a
Beauty.
real thing. I looked it up. I've
I
eaten
did
Black Beauty
too.
watermelon.
It's like
Yeah,
it's a really ripe watermelon. It's
yeah, they're
dark.
delicious.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but I
But sorry, Rasha, I just wanted to mention about the funeral that what stood out to me was like Milchick's Miss Wong says to Milchick, you shouldn't let them have a funeral. It makes them feel like people.
Hmm.
So again, these people are dehumanized, treated like lab rats or children, or more pointedly, perhaps maybe avatars. They're not real. They're just there for a job, or they're there to help facilitate Mark S completing Cold Harbor, whatever the hell that is. And that really struck with me because they have that really, really existential question. Oh, yes. And actually, Shidan, you're just saying in our chat room, Helena has literally said they're animals. They're
yes.
treated like the goats. And then on the other hand, 5 minutes later, Miss Wang is complaining that she practiced her theremin playing all day and Milchick didn't get her didn't let her do it. And he said, I promised you, she's still a child too. And yet she's talking about how we're treating these people like people. Well, that just really, really plays with the power dynamics, and it plays with this duality that Miss Wang's a child, and yet she's talking about existential questions about whether these people really exist. That's deep.
That duality I also feel is reflected in the room again, going back to Milchek's review, right? Because when he's constantly, did you notice how they started that conversation and they did talk about some of the positive things, but it seemed like there were more negative that
Mhm.
he was laying out for him. But in that too, the critique was that I felt the underlying message was these are not people. We have this mission. You need to do that, and you're messing up. And the messing up kind of came from a little bit about humanizing them or giving
Yeah.
them those
Mhm.
things, right? Seeing them as people.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
so true. He
Do you,
reminds,
yes.
Mr. Drummond reminds Milchick that their work will be remembered as one of the greatest moments on this planet. Like hyperbolic is one thing, and then that is on a whole other level of hyperbole. And he reminds them that they must treat the refiners as they really are. What the hell does that mean? And I'm hoping that we will further explore that, but that's, I think, really the crux of what's going on here, that they're just the creators of the show are starting to really throw out at us as little breadcrumbs so we can start to work out something very nefarious is going on here. And what is it?
I feel like so a theory I was thinking about was, are they creating a way to cheat death? I mean, you think about this, this refinery, you see these tools in the beginning that are used. They look like medical surgical tools to me. I'd have to go back and double check, but that's what it seemed like. And then we're
Yeah.
talking about the brain, and then we see the light process, the light flashing process that Mark S is going through. So I feel like there is something about whether it is preserving the human brain or the body or fighting a way to cheat death in some way. I don't know. We'll have to see how that unravels, but it's something I feel like to that effect.
You guys also notice that there's like a recurring motif of severed heads all over this episode and everywhere else. Whether it's
Yes.
the watermelon head that's just there by itself, almost like a severed head, or we were talking about this a little bit, Raja, the painting that we see when Helly goes downstairs and meets Miss Huang for the first time. It looks like severed heads on a beach somewhere with somebody just lording over them with like a sword, and I'm kind of just like, what's the deal with off with their heads kind of mentality here? I
Is
don't
that
know.
somebody here, by the way? Because the person who's standing, you have the heads, like you said, and the person who's standing actually has a sword.
Yeah.
And it's
And,
a very quick shot. So anybody who's watching would probably need to go back and watch it because it's a 2 second shot. But I think the colors of that painting and the heads and the way it's picturized, it definitely, I mean, it means something. There's a reason that they put it back there so all of us would see it. So, well, that's what I'm saying. So are we preserving the human brain somehow? Are we keeping
yeah.
it alive even after it dies? I don't know. I think that's gonna,
And hence the surgical implements that are being exported across
yeah.
the world. I don't know, like that is really important. I think that is actually something that we have to pay attention to. It may not necessarily be just a red herring. So that's fascinating to me.
And Shadan just also mentioned in our chat too about how we do see the intro taking place mostly in the brain than we ever did before. But speaking of the brain and time and all this, do you all think that the elevator is a time machine? Because I feel like there's some type of slight effects on their faces, especially with Mark, right? Yeah, it gets constricted or something whenever we see them go through the elevator. So or is that the time when the Audi is stepping out of the
Yeah.
box or the innie is
Yeah, we got it.
coming.
That's right. In fact, let's talk about the time again because it came up in one of our other videos. I think episode 2. One of our amazing viewers commented that you guys have forgotten about the cell phones, right? And we hadn't. Good point. But we were reminded about cell phones in this episode because Mark's in his kitchen and he's on his phone, and yet everything about this aesthetic of this show looks like the early 80s. The costuming, the cars, the production design, the printing. Like, do you all remember that printing? Because I certainly do. I'm old enough to remember that things that were printed on those papers. The videos, the everything about the show screams early 80s, and yet it's not necessarily in the early 80s. What's going on with the time period? And by the way, guys, I was listening to the Bulwark podcast with Tim Miller. It's a political podcast, and he had Ben Stiller on as a guest. It was a really interesting conversation. I highly recommend it. But when Tim asked him about the time period question, Ben Stiller was really cagey and didn't want to answer it, but implied that it was important. So
So
we
he
have
didn't
to really
exactly
dig deep
state
on
it.
that.
So Rob, he didn't exactly state it. I'm bringing
He
this
didn't
up because
say,
oh, that's interesting because I don't know if it was on one of I was pretty sure that on one of our comments too, somebody did mention how can we not tell? Why are we talking about the time period that it's easy to tell? And I thought, no, I don't think it's ever really been openly discussed out there. It's kind of been a guessing format for all of us. I mean, I
Certainly on the severed floor. Yeah.
yeah, and
yeah,
then even if you look at Devin and Rickon's house, right? Or wherever they stay to, the couch texture or the way the dining table is and the color, but the colors are so muted in there as well. So I think it's a
yeah,
little bit of a hard
but it
read.
is retro. There is a retro feel to it, for sure. And something else occurred to me. Sorry to jump around a bit, just talking about Rickon. In that scene with Rickon and Devon, I noticed Rickon using language that was a little bit anachronistic, a
Hmm.
little bit kind of like what Gwendolyn Christie's character was using in episode 3 about. I don't have any specific examples, but if you go back to it, he is imploring Devon to let him continue with this book and to work with Lumon, even though she believes, they're nefarious. And the way that he explained it to her felt very Egan-esque to me. And I wonder if that's just all in my head or whether it's actually a thing.
No, I feel like he kind of had was bought into their whole selling spiel. Like, because, Devin even makes a comment, or no, he makes a comment about Natalie, and it was an eye roll for her. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you've bought into this bullshit. This is like they're cheating people, they're liars, they're not authentic. And that's not the human being or the person that her husband is, right? And when she looks at the old book that he's written, these points, she even says, they're not yours. These are not your thoughts.
Hmm.
That I thought was kind of interesting.
Well, I don't think this is too much of an outlandish theory, but especially when we hear like this is the biggest thing that's ever happened in the history of the world or whatever. I mean, they're clearly living in some sort of society or something that's been
Yeah.
blocked off. I mean, that's really the only explanation for why things are so anachronistic. I don't know if you guys, one of
Mm.
my favorite movies is Blast from the Past with Brendan Fraser, but like I do think that maybe, that's why everything is so self-contained and a lot of things that maybe don't make sense would make sense, like the Gwendolyn Christie and the pouches and sort of if they're
Yeah.
not really interacting with the quote unquote real world and they don't really know what things look like, then that's why that is. But then how do you explain maybe Devin and Rickon that are not severed? Like, are
Mhm.
are we kind of dealing with a scenario where people are involved with Lumen without even knowing that they're involved with Lumen? Like, one of my biggest questions when we started this podcast was how big of a scope are we dealing with here? But if we're really looking at something that's going to change the course of human history, then it's not too far to say then that maybe they're in some sort of alternate country, world,
Yeah.
society. Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, Shadan. I mean, we've never gotten answers since the first season about where this takes place, what state, what town, what city, et
Mm.
cetera. And I think that that's intentional. I hate to reference bad movies, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of The Village. How these
Mm.
people are just like
I love that
basically,
movie.
yeah, right? Like
M.
they're a
Night.
society brainwashed into thinking that this is 1800s or whatever, and they don't know that the rest of the world exists. It could be a very much a village situation, and this could be some sort of an island that's trying to export things to the rest of the world or something like that. That's just kind of, it started out as an experimental Jonestown kind of thing, which would explain the cultish behavior and everything like that. So yeah, I think that those are answers that definitely will be coming at some point, but definitely haven't been answered yet.
This is a
Yeah.
lab. with a bunch of rats scurrying around. So I think
Yeah, in a wheel.
that remains to be seen. We're going to go into episode 6. Where do you think we stand? I feel like we're going to see a little bit more of Gemma, Miss Casey, Mark S. opening up more and seeing us where that leads. I'm hoping to see his second session to see if that reveals more, because I feel like he is now definitely convinced that Gemma is alive. And we're getting to learn more about his personality a little bit more, who he is as an outie. So I think that that's going to be fun. And Irv, I want to see Irv at Bert's home with him and Feels and kind of see how that dynamic evolves and what that means for him both as his innie and outie. And are we going to ever even see Irv go back to an innie? Because we may not. Maybe Irv is going to be the savior who is now semi-connected to that innie world, knowing what happened, but his outie is going to be like the Superman, of this series that's going to go in and save the day. I don't know.
That's a good point. Like thinking ahead, it occurred to me we haven't seen a lot of Miss Cobell. Like Patricia Arquette has not been in this series much at all. I hope we see more of her. And for some reason, I linked that to Mark is coughing and spluttering a lot, and Cobell had that breathing apparatus in her car. And could there be some kind of link between sickness? I think Rasha, you mentioned earlier that or maybe it was Shadan, when Mark's outside, he looks sickly. When he's inside, he doesn't. And so now I'm going down this crazy rabbit hole about sickness and breathing and all that kind of thing. So I'm hoping that comes to fruition, because I'm wondering why we kept seeing Mark cough and splutter. It was intentional. And then why we haven't seen Patricia Arquette much, and wondering when she'll come back, because she's always such a highlight on this show and we haven't seen a lot of her yet.
Yes. And I do think she will be returning because she's done the press run. So I don't think she would be doing press if she was only going to show up in one episode. So I think we'll be seeing more of her. Shadan, what are you anticipating to see in episode six or would like to see?
Well, I do think episode 6 is going to be a major turning point. I don't know if this is too insider baseball, but there must be a reason why they've only given press 6 episodes. I'm assuming that's because it ends on some sort of cliffhanger that they want people talking about. So that means something. Not to keep harping on the intro, but the intro kind of ends with it kind of going outer in scope, and we see Patricia Arquette's character. So I think playing with perspective is going to be really important this season. So, Rasha, you mentioned lab rats. Like, are the lab rats themselves being tested on by another set of lab rats? Like, are we going to open up to this broader perspective? And to also be a dork, I think we've seen a lot of really cool cultural references this season. There's a lot of like Westworld, a little bit of Succession. This episode reminded me a lot of also like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind a little bit. So like what is Ben Stiller kind of watching and referencing and playing with, and like, I kind of want to, I'm so glad you mentioned that podcast because I kind of want to get into his brain and see what's inspiring him and how those seeds may play out for the rest of the season.
I mean, it'd be great to process Ben Stiller's mind on here, right? I think there's 10 episodes though in total for this season, for season 2.
Yeah.
So, Mike, what are your thoughts?
I definitely echo that we need to see more Cobell. There's part of me that thinks that she might end up being an unlikely ally with Irv to try and take down Lumen. Just because of, they're both on the outside right now, and they both seem to be doing the work for that. But more than that, I want to see what happens with Dylan and the instructions that Irv left behind for him about the exports hall. The more answers that I get about the exports hall, the happier that I'll be. It's so creepy, and we know nothing about it. And if Dylan's search, basically kickstarts that, those reveals, then I'll be incredibly satisfied. So that's what I'm hoping for in the next one.
I think there definitely will be a reveal. What I didn't get was why he put the drawing back. Because I thought, because I don't know if he has access to that room again.
That's
So
true.
I was like, why aren't you taking the drawing with you? I don't know if his any at that moment grasped what it meant. So I was like, take the drawing. And the directions on the back were so intricate. I was reading that paper, I paused it and I was like, oh my God, I'd probably get lost with all the lefts and the rights on there. But it was very detailed, which again shows you how detail oriented Irv is. And he definitely has a very, very large background or very significant background in this kind of investigative work.
Can I say
Mhm.
something terrible slash controversial? I feel like we're supposed to be watching this show, like rooting for them to take down Lumen, but I kind of want Lumen to get away with whatever they're doing because I want to know what it is.
We will find out, Shadan. We will find out. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on another episode of Processing Severance. I, of course, want to thank my team, Mike, Shadan, and Rob. We've had such a great time just watching these episodes and sharing and talking to all of you. And if you have any questions or thoughts you want to share with us, don't forget our email, processingseverance@gmail.com. We do check and we do respond. Or you can always leave comments on our YouTube. And of course, you've got all the podcast site platforms that have this podcast. So thank you once again for joining us, and we'll catch you next week with another episode.